Hi, and welcome to Master's Choice Podcast, Episode 7. Glad that you could join us today to hear this exciting podcast. We've got Cullen Johnson in the studio with us this morning or today. And Cullen is our plant breeder here at Master's Choice. And so, Cullen, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. And let's see. Tell us exactly what a plant breeder at Master's Choice does.
Well, first off, thanks for having me again.
No, you're not welcome.
Oh, well, again, it's same thing from last time, but no, a little bit about what I do is as I'm creating the new lines that will end up in a Master's Choice lineup, and that backs up even into the female side and the male side of the hybrid that goes into our bags that the farmer plants. So look, that's just a brief overview of what I do. There's a lot more that goes into that, but that is the gist of what I do, making new males and females for our hybrid lineup.
For hybrid lineup, good. And it's getting down to planting time here pretty quick. And so in the process of that, you'll be planting a nursery,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And nursery's not like babies in baby bed, but it's basically a spot where you look at these inbreds, that you plant these inbreds, that you make crosses. What are some of the things that you do in the nursery?
So give a little perspective. This year we're going to be having about 6 acres worth of nursery. It's going to be, every row is a unique inbred population. So they have unique genetic backgrounds. And I am going through and I'm selecting out the ones that I would like to have move on for the next generation. I think like I said, about 6 acres, so I'm figured that roughly around 3,000 rows or so. Some of those will be hand crosses for our hybrids, making test crosses. So that will go into our experimental lineup, and we'll do some silage testing as well as grain testing next summer with those, as well as sending some of those off to Puerto Rico so we can see grow outs. But that's a little bit of what I do. I'm doing some inbred observations, some gene types of things, working with genes and molecular markers on a certain block. But the main priority of what I do is in inbred development and looking at screen populations for certain characteristics that we would like later on in our hybrids.
So what are those characteristics that you're kind of looking for?
I'm looking for a good solid plant, something has good stay green, that gives us a large harvest window. I'm looking for something that has softer grain texture, softer endosperm. And there's certain inbred lines that contain softer endosperm. There's some that contain really hard endosperm. So sifting through all of that, see some other characteristics. Obviously looking for something that's going to yield well later on in the hybrid. Females usually are the ones that you'll be able to select more for yield, whereas in males you'll be looking for some of the other characteristics like ear length or plant height, stuff like that. So that's kind of essentially just a few of the things that I look at whenever I'm in the nursery, but it's a unique thing walking a field like that. So.
Absolutely. So it sounds like that there's a lot of different genetic. I don't know if the background is the right word, but at least a lot of different genetic diversity going on. And when we think about that, for us, we understand that pulling those different backgrounds and making sure that when we put those together, that we get something kind of new and unique out of the hybrid. Is genetic diversity for a farmer important? And what exactly, when we think about that, what exactly would that look like?
Yeah, so that's very important. Kind of have the you don't put all of your eggs in one basket type of analogy. Okay. You want to diversify. For example, say take 2012, and a lot of us point back to 2012 as kind of an example for a lot of things. But in 2012, there were some hybrids that did very well, and their genetic backgrounds had high stress tolerance, high disease tolerance, and was able to get through some of those tougher times through the summer when we weren't getting as much rain. Whereas there were some that, only yielded about 20 bushel, and that was because of the genetic background. They weren't bred, or they didn't have the characteristics for drought tolerance or disease tolerance or whatever it was. So having a diversity of hybrids in your fields, not specifically this row is one hybrid and then this row is another hybrid, but diversity across all of your fields. Start selecting your eggs and putting them in different baskets.
So we had all of these hybrids that performed very well in 2012. Okay, so or better than others.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we just go ahead and do those every year if they're going to perform better under stress and disease and those things? Why wouldn't we just say, okay, well, let's get rid of these other genetics and let's just go for these that did well in 2012?
Well, a big part about that is hybrid placement. So environment's going to be different, climate's going to be different from every year, and so we can't really predict. We can make assumptions for a certain period of time, but we can't really predict what's going to be happening in the next 2 to 3 months. So having a diversified portfolio of hybrids can hedge your bets against certain deals. So if you're trying to say like getting rid of a hybrid in our lineup, hybrid might actually work better in another location, but we're putting it on our field because that's going to be a good solid average there.
So those hybrids that didn't do quite as well in 2012 may actually outperform the hybrids that did do well under other circumstances.
Yes, correct.
And so there's no need throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah, that's
just
correct.
because they didn't do well. And how much of that do you see with farmers even year to year when they select hybrids that hey, I picked this hybrid, I really liked it, but it didn't do well this year, and I'm getting rid of it, and I hate that thing, or even companies. What's the danger of that?
You're narrowing your diversity, really, and that's one thing that in modern breeding schemes that we have to expand actually in bringing in diversity of different germplasm. But I do see that a lot with farmers is that they'll think about last year, and then that's going to be kind of a decision maker for this next year. And again, year after year, they're not going to be the same, and that's kind of a danger that we can get into. An issue that we can get into as producers, corn producers, is that if we get our mindset on, well, last year it didn't work, then obviously this year it's not going to work. That's very dangerous, and we could lose out on some very good hybrids, even though they didn't perform in a certain year.
Okay, so how do you help a farmer, or how should we help farmers to kind of hedge their bets? What are some very basic principles as we go in on a farm as he's planning, and hopefully he's planning early, how can we help him plan for genetic diversity?
Well, having a good solid lineup with a bunch of, say within like 100-day to 105-day, there's probably about 5 or 6 hybrids within that in our lineup. So having a diversified, not just on relative maturity, but also on the hybrid genetics themselves, that can get you before some stress, say in the summer season, or maybe some after some stress based upon those relative maturities. If, for example, say a dealer's going on the farm, knowing what soil type is very important. Is it highly drained? Is it poorly drained? Is it silty loam, or is it a clay loam, or a clay? And we can, if we have a good solid lineup and has a lot of diversity through it, one of those hybrids will work well on certain environments, and work well in certain environments better than other ones within that certain relative maturity or hybrid lineups, area.
Okay. How many different hybrids? How many different genetic backgrounds? How many of that do we typically like to see? Would you like to see on a farm?
So this is where it kind of depends. So, different inbred, heterotic backgrounds, and this is a term that we use for, differences in backgrounds, the genetic differences in backgrounds. Some of those are better for the northern, climates, and some of those are better for the southern climates. And some of those work really well, bringing them up and bringing them back down in longitude, latitude, stuff like that. Really, there is about, if you like to clump things all together, there's about 8 different heterotic groups. And a combination of basically 4 stiff stalks, which are your females, and 4 non-stiff stalks, which are your males. And having combinations of each one of those, and that's roughly 16, I would like to see at least 8 different pairwise combinations between heterotic backgrounds within your area.
So in a typical on a typical farm, as he's planting hybrids, you know, he's not going to know all of those different heterotic groups and backgrounds, and the dealer may not know all of those. So how many specific hybrids do you think that a farmer ought to plant? You know, I mean, should he do? You know, we say diversity, so he says 2. I'll just give me 2, 3. I mean, where do we like to see that?
My preference would be right around 4 to 5,
Okay.
and it depends on how big your farm is. If you're
Sure.
only farming 10 acres,
Yeah.
you might want to split those up between 2 or 3.
Okay.
But if you're going to be farming 400 to 1,000 acres, I would say somewhere between the 4 and 5.
Okay.
Different hybrid ranges. It again depends on your soil type, depends on where you are at in longitude and latitude. But overall, I would say a good average would be 4 to 5. If you're going to be on some real tough soils, maybe a 5 or 6, somewhere right in there.
Okay. Okay. So you talk about, you know, we need to diversify as far as heterotic backgrounds. You also talked about relative maturity. Okay. I get a lot of guys, a lot of times that they will be like, oh, I'm planting 105-day corn. Okay. How much difference is there really between what is a 105-day corn and let's say even a 102-day corn? You know, some guys, I want 105. Well, I've got 102. Oh, that's too early. How much real difference is there between those relative maturities?
Well, when you watch it grow, it really isn't that much of a difference.
Okay.
3 days for relative maturity. Now, the term relative maturity is there because the 105-day corn could actually be a 104-day maturity. It's relative according to what its tester was back in our testing scheme. Okay. So, yeah, I would say that it probably isn't that big of an issue to plant, say 103 or 102 versus 105. Again, it depends on the year. Sometimes you'll have stress early, and you want to have a longer day hybrid to get you through that stress, so you can have your pollination window after that stress. And sometimes it may be your stress is later on in the season. You want to get before that stress, right before grain fill. So yeah, it really, really depends.
So what kind of relative maturity spread would you like to see on a farm?
I'm saying probably about 5-day.
Okay.
5-day spread would be good, because then you could start dipping into different genetic backgrounds.
Okay.
And this is where it comes back to the heterotic groups, is that these 8 heterotic groups basically all intertwine on each other within an 80 to 120 plus day. And there's some overlap between those middle grounds for sure. So I would say right around 5 days of relative maturity would be good.
Okay, so you start with this genetic diversity, and a couple of weeks ago, John Nadler was in, and he was talking about how traits and treatments preserve that genetic potential. So we've got this genetic potential. We want to preserve it. What are some management things, okay? And especially as we look at managing the soil and those kind of resources, what are some management things that we can do to protect that genetic potential and help that genetic diversity?
So this kind of goes back to one of our vlogs before, is that first having soil samples.
Okay.
Getting a good representative sample from your fields out of all the soil types in your fields and having it well documented is priority before planting, before even putting on any type of post or pre-emerge. So
when should we be taking soil samples?
I would say probably a good month and a half prior to. It gives you a good window. This depends on where you're at and if you get a lot of rain or if you get a lack of rain. But I would say at least a month and a half before.
Before planting?
Before planting, that is,
Okay.
yes. Because will be a little bit of leaching of nutrients within that month period before planting. And if you can get your sample off to the lab, they'll get a result back to you within that week. and then you can start making your decisions based upon, well, how much DAP do you need to put on, how much urea you need to put on, how much potash you need to put on, stuff like that. And
when you're talking about urea, you're not talking urine cakes.
no,
right?
no. Yeah. No. So, but to grow corn at about 175 bushel per acre field, and this is some grain data we were able to collect over multiple years at multiple universities. For that 175 bushel per acre average field, nitrogen needs to be about 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Potassium needs to be roughly about 65 pounds, and phosphorus needs to be right about 60.
And that's on the soil sample.
And that's so that is your recommendation to get you up to that level at 175 bushels per acre.
Okay.
Your soil sample could have less than that, and most often than not, you will have less than those thresholds for those.
So when we're looking at that soil sample, so we've gone out a month and a half, maybe 2 months before. We're looking at that soil sample, okay? And so I look at a lot of nutritional analysis when we're looking at corn silage, and I look at those, and a lot of times there's lots of letters and numbers and all kinds of things, and some of it is superfluous and some of it is useful. What are the most useful things a guy needs to be looking at when he looks at a soil sample?
Definitely your nitrate level that's currently available. Your phosphorus, which is, I'd have to go back, phosphorus level is your potassium thiosulfate, I think. I'd have to go back and look. And then your phosphorus and potassium. There are some micronutrients. Those are your macronutrients, I should say.
Okay.
Your micronutrients, sulfur, sodium, calcium, and magnesium are the other top ones to look at. You also get your pH, and that's your pH level for those that soil sample. That can help you with getting a lime recommendation to bring that pH back to a 7.0.
Okay. So you want pH in the middle.
Roughly.
You want
roughly middle. You don't want to make it acidic. You don't want to make it alkaline.
Okay. And that soil sample will tell me, kind of give me an indication of how much lime I need to put on that ground to bring it back to neutral. Now, why do I want it at neutral?
There's not going to be any issues with acidity. And when you think about acidity, that can hurt your soil or your root hairs, burn them off essentially. If it's too acidic, you're going to get burnt off. And alkaline, I'd have to go back and look, but it's somewhere right around that same issue. You could get some bad root growth.
Okay. And so these micronutrients, sulfur, sodium, all of these things, the soil. How do I just go out and get some sulfur and just throw it on?
No.
Do I just need to go get some, with sodium? Do I just, how are these applied? I mean,
that's something that in my areas that I've planted corn, I haven't had to mess with much. So I would definitely talk to your local co-op and see if they have any recommendations for any of those fertilizer applications that you can make for those micronutrients. So kind of outside of something that I've had to worry about, but your co-op, any type of co-op will have those types of information readily available.
So now going back to the macronutrients.
Yes. Yeah.
We're talking about nitrogen, we're talking about phosphorus, we're talking about potassium. Okay, N, P, and K, and so you mentioned that if you want 175 bushels of corn, there's certain levels that you need to be at. Is that going to be different when I'm looking at bushels versus corn silage?
So for an example, when we look at nitrogen, when we're going to be taking silage, you can back off of that about 10 pounds per acre because you are not going all the way to grain fill.
Okay.
You're taking it, about 10, 15 days prior?
It could be even more than that. Okay. I mean, you're taking it at, you want to take it at 65%
moisture, which is not, and you got to get down to 16% moisture for grain corn. So it's going to really depend on your area for your applications, but you could probably back off of each about 10.
Okay.
I wouldn't back off too much for the phosphorus or potassium because
Sure.
you could get some purpling and some things
Absolutely.
happen, and that won't be good in your samples. Plus, because the types of phosphorus that is in your feed will end up into the manure and could end up being a problem ecologically or environmentally for that area.
Very much so. Now, so some of these guys are going to be spreading manure. Do they need to be testing their manure before they put it on, and it's going to correlate with their soil sample?
Yes, yeah, I would. Definitely would.
So they need to be knowing what nutrients and stuff are in that manure.
Correct.
How much nitrogen is actually in there? How much
Yes.
how much of these things are in there, so that we can match what we're going to need for that crop.
Correct. And for example, nitrogen. One of the things with nitrogen is you can either you'll get better availability of that nitrogen. It's called a nitrogen credit when you apply. Say you put soybeans down, you get roughly a 40 pounds per acre nitrogen credit from prior years. So when you put manure on, you're roughly getting, it kind of depends between species, but dairy or beef, you're getting right around 10, 11 pounds if you incorporate that. And incorporating is injecting or mixing in with the soil about 72 hours after you spreaded it. So you're getting roughly 11 pounds per acre off of your manure. If you don't incorporate it, you're only getting about 9. So one of the things you'll have to adjust for is either if you incorporate it or if you don't. I would say definitely test your manure and see what it is at that time. These are all averages over multiple year tests, but I would definitely test your manure, see what you got to make up for it to get you to that for certain threshold that you need. And go from there.
Cool. So we talked a little bit about manure. So what other ways can we apply? What other ways can we go ahead and get to the levels that we need?
So for nitrogen, there's a few options that we have. Urea, which can be sprayed on as a post-emergence, and that's what I typically like to use. And you can use anhydrous ammonia, which that can be fall applied, which I don't recommend necessarily because you will lose nitrogen over the winter cycle. Or you can do a pre-emergence application, a spring pre-plant, I should say, or you can side dress right after the plants start to get it up, and that'll be right next to the plant, not right on top of the plant.
So, I mean, at what point am I going to be thinking about side dressing? Are we talking, and we could talk about, V3 or V4, but really, I think a lot of times are we talking knee high, thigh high, ankle high? I mean, where are we looking at?
I would like to get in there before it even gets close to knee high because your highest nitrogen fixing point is going to be those early growth stages, and that's where a lot of that nitrogen is being used up, so it can grow that plant, so it can start fixing that nitrogen into the plant and be able to grow quickly.
So we're looking at V3, V4.
Yes, yeah, I would get in there early. Things like phosphate, you got DAP, you got superphosphate, and you got triple superphosphate. Again, those can be applied pre or post. And then
are those dry, or are they wet, or are they
I believe those are dry. Those are dry. And then you also have potassium, which is potassium chloride, potassium sulfate, and potassium thiosulfate.
So with potassium sulfate, okay, is there an added benefit there of getting some of the sulfur that we may need?
You can get a little bit, but you're not going to be getting a lot because that potassium is the one that I would think you wouldn't get a lot, but now that I think about it a little more, because potassium has, and this is going back to the science of it, potassium would be holding on 4 chlorine ions. So I would assume then, you probably would be getting some good chlorine, but one of the things is chlorine. If you're using potassium chloride, there usually isn't any problems with having a lower chlorine content. I would say in potassium sulfate, though, you would probably get some good beneficials there by having the sulfide ions on those fertilizer applications.
Absolutely. So we talked about genetic diversity. We've talked about some management of nutrients in the soil. One of the other things that's really detrimental that we sometimes take for granted. I think it's just maybe it even comes automatically. Is weed management, and we hear a lot about weed resistance. So how is weed management changing? Why is it important? What kind of things do we need to be thinking about, especially as guys are starting to burn off fields now and getting ready to plant and then post planting?
So, and you were saying guys burn off fields now. That is one of the probably the most important things to do is to start with your fields clean. Right when you go into start planting, you really want those clean because any plant, any weed out there that isn't whatever you want to plant and what you want to get your yield off of. When it reaches roughly 3 to 4 inches tall, you're going to be losing about 2 to 3 bushels per acre from each day following that all the way up until you get to that pollination window. So again, start early, start with a clean field, and get those guys burned off because they're going to be causing issues for you all the way through. Personally, I grew up in an area where we had palmer issues and foxtail issues and giant ragweed issues. And when you let those suckers get tall, they just bolt and they get ahead of you. And I was the one that my dad would always get me to go out there with a hoe and getting those fields cleaned back up. So, so starting early and getting those out of the way early is something that I recommend.
Well, unless you have a lot of kids.
Oh, yeah, unless you have a lot of kids.
Unless you have a lot of kids, and then you can just turn them loose.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So, so getting them early, that's key. How do we deal with those weeds that may be resistant? And how do we keep from having that problem?
So, because over the last years we've been really using the same herbicides over and over and over, that's been able to build us up resistance of certain, so for example, giant ragweed. Giant ragweed is one that's tolerant and resistant, and there's a difference between the two. Tolerant is where they can get hurt a little bit, but they still power through and get the seed set, while resistance is they don't even recognize that the chemical's being sprayed on them. So one of the things, just to continually scout and look for those, if they become an issue and say you only have 2 or 3 after an application of some type of herbicide, if 2 or 3 of those pop up, get out there with the hoe and get those out before they put any seed on. That's for a lot of people now, that's not very useful because those weeds have been able to propagate and it's going throughout the whole field now. So at that point, what I would probably do is use a different mode of action.
Okay.
And to begin with,
when you talk about different mode of action, you're talking about explain that just a little bit because sometimes we get caught up in these terms and we use them a lot, but different mode of action simply means
the way the herbicide works. It works on a different biochemical pathway within the plant.
Okay.
And what we've done is we've created herbicides over the last 60 years that have not affected corn as much or affected beans as much, or we've inserted a transgene so it doesn't recognize it or it gets digested. The herbicide chemical itself gets digested. And so when you want to have multiple modes of action, and again, change of different, it's just a different biochemical pathway than, say, another chemical is. You start working on different biochemical pathways, and that plant may not be having the same resistance as the other mode of action has.
So let's just take it for instance.
Yeah.
Okay. So you got glyphosate.
Yes.
All right. And you have atrazine. Okay. Mm-hmm. So they work at killing the plant in a different way.
Correct.
Okay. Right. And so some plants that may be resistant to one or the other, you spray the other one on it, and it basically kills it because it's not resistant to that same type of killing.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Correct. And at that point, if you do have resistance, I would again use 2 or 3 different types of mode of action because you've already started to build that resistance up. You don't want to build another resistance up to another mode of action. And that's a way you can hedge, or you're able to keep yourself from having resistance starting to build up, is using 2 or 3 or 4 different modes of action, and doing that in different times throughout the year. Say this year we use a glyphosate on say our cornfields because we have the GT gene in it. But next year we use an HPPD, which is like a Callisto or one of those types of herbicides. And then next year we buy say like a Liberty, and have some corn with some Liberty genes in it, and you're killing those plants off that could have gotten the resistance to last year's application this year, so that they don't propagate and become issues for you later down the road.
All right. No, it sounds good. So, what is the worst case scenario if weeds aren't managed properly? I mean, let's paint the blackest of night pictures here. For guys who don't manage weeds properly.
Well, you're the guy at the coffee shop that everybody's saying, "Oh, look at that guy's field; it's really dirty." And there's been times that I've driven around Indiana, back where I'm from, and I've really seen some fields, and they've been bad. And you kind of look at them like, well, was there an issue that you got into there? You couldn't get into there; it was too wet or something. But you could be that guy, but the weeds, like I said, they're going to be drawing back 2 to 3 bushels every day. And so when you start adding that up for 4 or 5 weeks every day, you're losing, 100 bushel easy when those weeds get big. And if there's a thick amount of weeds, that's when you really start losing, because weeds at about that 3 to 4 inch stage, they start sequestering nitrogen. Okay. And so anything that you've applied, any manure you've applied or urea you applied, you're starting to lose that to the weeds. And you can lose up to about 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre per weed if you leave that to go on for the full season.
Wow. So not only are you losing yield, but you're also basically wasting the money that
the money you just put into it
out there. So if I heard you right and understand you, one of the biggest problems or the biggest culprits or causes of resistant weeds is the fact that we have probably sprayed the same chemical on the same field for several different years.
Yes, correct.
Okay, and so as much as we have crop rotation that's going to help with things, we probably need some herbicide rotation.
Correct.
Okay. And just going different year with a different herbicide with that different mode of action that's going to kill that plant in a different way to keep those resistant weeds down, and even to maybe even take care of those resistant weeds that we already have.
Correct. That's correct. Yeah, and then that's all part of your management strategy. Is one, I think being open to utilizing different things is very key, and that's for your hybrid selection. As well as for your herbicide selection. I think that's high importance in a management strategy, is that if you diversify those things, you can be a better farmer, one, and be able to fight off anything that could be an issue for later generations, say your kids or your grandkids that might end up farming those same acres that you did, and making it overall a better experience for them, so that they can start using some of the same mode of action, and we don't start losing herbicides because we start getting resistance in all of our weeds.
Absolutely. So we've been talking about genetic diversity, preserving that genetic potential. One other management strategy that we're going to talk about is going to be crop rotation. Earnest Weaver is going to be joining us, calling in, and so Ernest, we're gonna have him call in and talk about crop rotations and the importance of that and how that's going to help. So joining us today by phone is Earnest Weaver. He is the territory manager of the Southwest for Byron Seed. Been a good friend of Master's Choice for lots of years. In fact, I'll even say Ernest is a friend of mine. Okay, and so I don't know if that's good for you, Ernest, or not. I don't know if that'll gain you any points anywhere, but we appreciate you. We appreciate you joining us today, and going to be talking through some cover crops. Ernest, tell us a little bit about what's going on with you and what exactly being a territory manager at Byron Seeds means.
Well, as a territory manager, I'm working with the dealers in dealer education and helping them serve their communities to the best of their ability. And as far as our mission statement at Byron Seed, we want to have productive farms, but while we have these while we're getting production off the farms, we want to build the soil. We feel that soil life is so critical to long-term sustainability of the farm, and so we look for practices that are going to get really good forages for our cows, but also build their soils.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. So in what ways through crop rotation, Ernest, are we building soils, and what exactly is crop rotation?
Well, traditionally, when we talk on crop rotation of corn and soybeans, for example, that is a rotation, but it's not a sufficient rotation. We feel that we don't have enough rooting action from just those two crops. If we can come in and incorporate a grass style crop like wheat with that, where it would be corn, soybeans, and wheat, we would come a lot closer to having a rotation that we can build the soil. But the rotations that we find to be especially what we consider a solid rotation is where we can have a field in hay production or pasture production for a number of years, followed by a corn soybean rotation, and then back into forage production.
So that all sounds good. That makes sense. Tell us exactly why the rotation, or how the rotation helps to build the soil.
Well, soil building is only going to be done by root action. Really, we say sometimes 90% of any soil building is going to be riding on the back of root production. And so in a traditional corn and soybean rotation like we talked about earlier, we're only going to have active living roots growing in the soil about 3 months out of the growing season. And so we're going to have to be looking at a rotation of or a field management that is going to have roots growing at least 9 months out of the year.
Okay. So as much as it's about rotating crops in and out, it's also about kind of the catchphrase, or it's really a true phrase, of cover crops, right? Cover crops that go in afterwards. All right. And for those guys who are livestock producers, cover crops can also be profitable forages, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so if I'm a livestock producer, and so I grow corn silage. Let's just go with it. I'll throw you a softball here, okay? I grow corn silage. I've come in. I said, I want to build my soil. I need a cover crop. What are some options for me if I'm feeding either beef or dairy? Let's just say I'm going to I'm feeding dairy. And what are some cover crop options for me that I can use after that corn?
Okay. When we're looking at a corn crop, we're looking at a crop that usually, if we're going to get maximum yield out of the corn, we're going to have excessive amounts of nitrogen. In other words, after the corn is finished, we're still going to have a significant amount of nitrogen left in the soil. So I like to come back, if I chop corn silage, coming back with triticale.
Okay.
Is going to be a small grain crop that has tremendous root growth, but we get a lot of top growth as well. I can grow a lot of good quality forage in the fall, or depending which triticale I plant, I might have it for spring an early spring cutting. But I think triticale lends itself well because it will scavenge the nitrogen that is left over after a good corn crop, but it also feeds very well with corn silage, and so that it just makes sense. Now, if I must bring corn back on that field because of production limitations, and I'm going to have to grow corn on corn, if I come in there with triticale and perhaps a blend of triticale and crimson clover, for example, then my cropping system is no longer corn on corn, but it's corn, clover, and triticale, and then back to corn. And so all of a sudden, even though I'm growing corn every year, it's not corn on corn because I've got these other roots going. And so a combination of small grain and clover, I really like as a very manageable system that can give me a lot of feed and yet build my soil and capture leftover fertility.
Okay, so that's and you're basically going to harvest those off as some form of baleage or something along those lines, or silage, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
I would harvest that as wet.
Okay, as wet, yeah. So what if I'm just going to graze? Say I've got corn silage, and or you've I mean, you and I, we kind of give each other fits about this, but say I've grown that nasty stuff sorghum, right? And I take that off and I'm gonna graze. I'm a beef guy, or maybe I'm just gonna background some cows on it or something. What if I'm gonna graze in the fall? What would you use? Anything different?
Well, if I'm grazing in the fall, I really like to go in with a brassica, like radish, or possibly a mixture of radish and turnips, along with oats. Now, I had mentioned triticale. You could go with the spring triticale, whose growth habit is very similar to oats. But I do like the oats and turnip combination because I can grow a lot of feed in, say, if I chop corn in corn silage in August, the last of August and September and 1st of October, I can grow quite a few tons of feed per acre that I can strip graze. And then depending on what I'm going to do with that field the following year, that particular combination of cover crops is going to winter kill. And so the roots will still be there, and they're still going to be helping to hold the soil together, as it were, but come spring, the field will be relatively clean.
Okay. And so that would be good even for a row crop guy, for a guy who maybe he's going to have that corn soybean rotation.
It's very good for somebody getting his feet wet with cover crops, because then all of a sudden he has a self-terminating cover crop, and it's an easy thing for him to incorporate.
How much benefit, and I would assume that there's a nitrogen benefit in cover crops. How much have you seen? What's typical? What's normal? When we think about that?
Well, when we use a scavenging crop, like a radish, turnip, a small grain, or something of that nature that is going to scavenge nitrogen, it's very common to carry 60, 70 units of nitrogen forward for the next crop with that. And that especially is critical in our low organic matter soils, because the low organic matter soils don't have the capacity to hold the nitrogen, and so if there isn't a scavenger crop there, it's quickly going to be lost. And so it's not at all uncommon to glean 60 or 70 units of nitrogen that we can carry to the next crop with that type of cover crop.
So that kind of makes up for the guy who's going to say, well, I've got to buy the cover crop seed and I've got to go out there and there's going to be too much expense. But if he weighs that against how much nitrogen he's saving, there's really no expense there.
Right. And with that root action, we are showing potentially 20,000 pounds of roots per acre in the soil, and those roots all add to the carrying capacity of the soil, or of the ability of that soil to hold nutrients, keep it in the root zone until our next crop needs that. And so by using these cover crops, we actually are able to have a better nutrient delivery to our corn crop, and consequently grow higher quality corn.
Good. Ernest? Oh, man. So did we get high quality corn in there, though?
Hello?
Hey, the polite thing to do is say goodbye before you hang up.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Not a problem. Hey, we got to the
If
point.
I would have known I was going to hang up, I would have said goodbye.
Not a problem, buddy. Hey, we actually got to the point where you said higher quality corn, and so what I'll do is I'll just kind of wrap it up and tell you thanks, and see if there's any last thought that you had, and then we'll go from there. So we'll let you go. All right. Hey, Ernest, yes, you're exactly right, man. High quality corn, high quality forage is definitely key there. And it looks like cover crops are going to be one of the ways that we can help manage through that. Appreciate you joining us today, Ernest, and calling in and talking through this. Any last thoughts that you had? Anything else that you wanted to say right before we let you go?
Not really, other than that I feel that there is a lot to learn yet about the use of cover crops, but whatever our farming practice is, we've got to be building our soils and not letting it deteriorate.
Absolutely.
And as we build our soils, the better our soils become, the better we can unlock the genetic potential of really high quality crops like the corn you were talking about growing.
Absolutely. Ernest, thanks. We appreciate it. Thanks for being such a great resource. And hey, you and I will have to catch up sometime.
Okay. Hey, you're quite welcome, Mark.
Hey,
thanks for calling.
Okay. Bye-bye. Ernest, thanks for calling in. We appreciate that great knowledge on crop rotations. You just spending some time helping us to understand the importance of all of that. So, Cullen, before you head off to all the busy things that you've got to do, I'm going to kind of give you the last word. We talked about genetic diversity, we talked about crop rotation, we talked about all of these things. But just, before you leave, I just want to make sure that there isn't something that you've thought about or something that you heard that maybe just sparked something else, or maybe just, you just want to tell us one last thing.
Be open to the options that your dealer has for her hybrid placement, hybrid options. Be open for that. Listen to their guidance. They're very knowledgeable. Talk to your co-op guys. Get your soil samples in early, and really be overall a good farmer that takes care of his land, takes care of what you put onto that land, and so that we can keep those for future generations. And I'd like to say thank you for having me. It's been a good time, and being able to share a little bit about my knowledge. So
absolutely, Cullen. Enjoy working with you. Cullen and I, we get to look at each other every day we're in the office. Yeah. we look through each other, and so Cullen's a joy to work with, especially coming from the nutrition side, being able to work with the plant breeder very, very closely. And so, hey, we appreciate you guys who are out listening, joining us today. We appreciate you being part of this. As always, we are social. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and always, of course, at seedcorn.com. Appreciate you guys.